Dharmesh is the founder and CTO of HubSpot. HubSpot, by the way, happy birthday, 17 years. You're 17 years old again. They started here in the CIC, and I thought that he might start us off with a little story about us there. Yes. Tim, thanks. Dharmesh, I don't know if you can see it, but Tim is here in the audience as well. So we were hoping he would start us off with a quick story. Before, I just want to finish off this amazing bio. He started out in another industry, pyramid technologies, for a while, which he was also very successful in. And I wonder if there's some differences between those two ventures that he started. He's also an angel investor, one of the common mass angels here, and has invested in a number of companies, which you can see. He's a writer and does an amazing amount of content online, and is now the new creator of the incredibly successful Wordplay, which started as a wonderful project with this. Dharmesh, did I leave anything else out?
Nope, that's more than necessary.
Okay, great. So would you take us away? First, we'd love to know a little bit about your favorite CIC story, and then we'd welcome your critique of my thriving in the new economy.
Yeah, my favorite CIC story, since Tim is in the room now, I'm going to switch it out. My favorite CIC kind of memory is Tim repeatedly. Let me start out from the beginning. So when Brian, my co-founder, and I first started HubSpot, we were still grad students at MIT, which was kind of right across the street from 1 Broadway, where CIC's main office is and was. And it was like the perfect thing. This is like AWS for physical space before there was that kind of thing, right? It's like, oh, why would we not do this? It made so much sense. So we went from, like a one desk a piece for both Brian and I, and we kind of upgraded to a bay, which could seat like 4 people, even though there were only 2 of us, because we had aspirations for growth. It's like, we will double headcount someday. It'll be awesome. We'll go from 2 to 4. And we just loved it so much there. We kind of expanded and kept expanding and kept expanding. And the most vivid memories I have are conversations with Tim, where he was trying to convince us that it was now time for us to like move on, because when we had gone from like 2 desks to a bay to multiple bays, and then there was like a floor within the building that says, okay, well, we have some space down there that Google just exited on. It's like, okay, as long as you manage it and we're still part of CIC, we're okay with that. And so then we had this like part of an entire floor still within CIC, still had access to all the infrastructure and the services. But we were just big, huge fans, right? Like, it helped us kind of focus on our customers and focus on the business and not have to worry about all the things that one has to worry about. And you don't really appreciate how much like headache that is until you've actually tried to like open your own office, right? Which I've done at times before. So anyway, we're huge fans, have been for a long, long time. So yeah.
Thank you, Dharmesh. Thanks. We'll say a big thanks to Tim. Hopefully most people here would echo it, which is, it's a tremendous environment to be a part of. It's wonderful. And the relationships like this specific one happens when you just bump into people at the super cool kitchen or cafe that you're hanging out at, or at events like this. So I think the space really misses you guys
Although
too.
A lot of our early customers were CIC members as well. So not to discount the relationship part of it, but anyway, yes.
Super cool. Great. Wonderful. So tell us a little bit, thriving in the new economy. I just want to say, the foundational elements, does that resonate sort of with what you've experienced growing for yourself and then as a leader? And then we'll dive into some specific questions around productivity.
Yeah, it resonates a lot with me. I think, I've been, building companies and writing software for 30 years now. So I've been doing it for a long time, and 17 of them have been at HubSpot, which has done reasonably well. And if I kind of trace back, some of the kind of roots of the modest success we've had kind of building the culture and kind of growing the company, which is now 7,000 people. It's, we started with this kind of notion, both Brian and I, because we didn't really technically use the word culture at all in the early years. What we really first started with is like, we want to build a company that the 2 of us enjoy working in. And that was our heuristic for whether we were doing things right or not, because it's like, and I've kind of learned this, and I didn't know this as crisply or as sharply in my early years, but every company will have a culture.
Yeah.
Now, you can choose to either build a culture that you actually drive joy from, that's effective and functional and attracts the right kind of people. And so my kind of advice is, whether no matter what you do, you're going to have a culture. Might as well build one that actually supports what your ambitions are and makes you happy. And that's what we did, and that ended up working out well. So this goes back to your kind of point on balance. Like, one of the things I think that one of the mistakes entrepreneurs make is around this kind of um, this notion around impact and balance, which is they measure the wrong things. And this is that hustle culture that I think is just too pervasive in startup land. And don't get me wrong, I've been part of startups my entire professional career, so I'm not quite as extreme as someone like an Elon Musk, but also not at the other end of the spectrum. I think of myself as a pragmatist. But I think the biggest mistake entrepreneurs make is that they measure the wrong thing, right? Which is they measure, how many hours a week or whatever, how many meetings they had, how many pitches they did, how much it's like, and that's all fine as far as activity. And sometimes those are correlated with the impact and the outcomes you're looking for, but not always. And so I think it's more helpful. And this comes down to something you've done a lot of work on, Narath, is around if you really want to solve and optimize for impact, then you sort of need to kind of recognize the fact that a lot of your kind of actual productive, impactful work happens in a very condensed amount of time, right? Which is you're in the flow state or you're in the zone, whatever phrase you want to use, and that and I've learned this over my entire professional career is that if you kind of trace back the most creative ideas you've had, the most productive times you've had, the most impactful work you've done, it will always be usually in those kind of times of flow. And so if you kind of take the first order derivative of that, that means, okay, well, if I can now increase and optimize for the times that I'm in that flow, that maximizes my use of time to create the impact I'm looking for, that is a much better way than measuring the hours in a week or like, did I take all the meetings I could have done and having FOMO around, did you go to all the events you should have gone to? Like at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter all that much. And so if I had one piece of advice, and I give this to all the HubSpot employees that I've learned, is that you need to get much better as a human and as an entrepreneur to say at saying no. And this is going to sound so trite. It's because we're all bound by the same laws of space and time, despite our best efforts to bend them. Is that every time you say yes to anything, literally anything, you are saying no to something else, right? There's something else you're swapping it out for, and we as entrepreneurs and as good people, and this is a mistake HubSpotters make all the time, which is we tend to hire nice, respectful, helpful people. And so when a colleague asks them, it's like, oh, can you help me with this project? Can you do this? Can you add this to your list of things? Their tendency is to always say yes, because we want to be positive, helpful people and be good team players. And that is not always the right choice. You have to sort of force yourself to kind of look at your list of things you've already said yes to and say, which one of those things am I going to take off my list that will then permit me to say yes to this thing I'm about to say yes to. So don't write checks that your schedule can't cash, so to speak. Anyway.
Yeah, great. It sounds like hard-won advice. Recognize how hard it is to do it, especially when people around you are expecting sort of the sacrifice of hustle culture. They're like, I don't know how to measure your value. I know how to get a sense of like how hard you seem to be working. From an investor perspective, that's also a really hard thing to see. Like, are you working really hard? Are you showing up? Are you answering my calls all the time? How do you think about that? Like, if you're working with somebody, how do you coach them in that? It's you evaluating that company versus another company.
Yeah, like in my mind, I think we over-index on what we think investors are actually looking for. So if you actually talk to investors, both angel investors and even institutional investors, they're really not solving it. As this goes to your question on burnout early on that the investor was asking. Like the best investors are actually looking for disproportionate outcomes, right? They're not looking for like, oh, if they got measured on the number of hours that their founders spent in the company, that would be great. That's what they would be indexing. But they know that that's not the case. If they've done it for any period of time, which many of them have, and they have a large portfolio, it's like, and this is not to say that hard work isn't important. I don't want to kind of discount that, because in any competitive endeavor, be it entrepreneurship, which is obviously competitive, but if you look at music, you look at athletics, there is a sacrifice. You can't like play the game and expect to win in something that's a relatively, whether you're competing for market share, customers, whatever it is, investor dollars. But that's not the sole thing, and it's easy to over-index on it just to make investors or some other third party happy, and that's usually not actually what they're looking for. So I just be careful there in terms of, it's like, okay, I want to make sure I demonstrate to my investors that I'm working really hard. It's like,
yeah,
the best way to demonstrate that is to achieve outcomes and measure the right things.
Great. So a positive spin, I guess, would be like being brave enough to say that, hey, I'm actually going to work at the top of my game. This is how I work at the top of my game, as opposed to you knowing that it's going to be this unsustainable hustle culture style.
Yeah. Well, by the way, just before I forget, because it's kind of on that same thread, one of the things we have to recognize is that for most of us, success is going to be more than just the co-founding team. So whether you're one person or two people or four people, whatever it is, that you're going to want to grow that team sometime, right? And everyone, I think, will accept and will, I think, would readily stipulate that we all want to hire the best possible people ever, right? That's the thing that everyone says. That's very cliched and true. And the thing we have to recognize, though, even if, let's say, we're like, oh, like I'm going to get measured on these hours, and this is the thing, and I'm going to crank it out. I'm going to have this hustle culture. Let's say, for a fraction of a second, maybe you're even somewhat right. You will actually fail at attracting the team that you want, because even though you may be willing to do that because you're over indexing on a certain thing or whatever, if that's the message you kind of communicate to the world and communicate to the people you're trying to recruit, or if that's a sense they get, you're not going to attract, not in this market, not in any market, actually. You're not going to attract the best people, right? And not to say you don't want to find people that are kind of committed to the mission, willing to work hard, willing to kind of be honest with themselves and have a self-awareness around, whether the right things are happening or not. If you have that kind of hustle culture mentality, I just think it attracts the wrong kind of people over the long term.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we saw that in an earlier interview we did. Eagle from Da Vinci, and he was like in his 20s. This was all that he was doing, right? So he was just living, breathing the standard hustle culture stuff. But he had employees who started having families, and all of a sudden he had to grow up real fast, whether he wanted to change or not. But like the people around him were changing, and it was clear that they were not going to do the work the way he did it, and this old school style of hustle culture. And that was the defining moment, I think, for him, where he realized, whoa, well, maybe my life could be different too. So, yeah, very hard-won lessons. You are very productive. Do you have some things, productivity, I guess, being defined as like, unit of output per time in the classic definition. Time, I think, is, for me at least, the critical factor that I have to talk to people about. How do you manage your time? Like, how do you?
Yeah, it's so it comes down to like a few kind of fundamental things. One is around this kind of notion of obviously measuring the right thing, and the other one is saying no. But this is also around this kind of notion of focus. So what I've managed to do, and I've been doing this at least a decade now, that I have three things that I'm working on that I'm kind of focused on. So I'm obviously the company is very, very large, but it's like, okay, well, right now my focus is let's say culture, brand, and platform, and those have been at times past my three foci. And so what the focus allows you to do, and especially first, is to know what those things are, whatever your kind of list is. But then it also gives you the permission to say no, which is the other important thing, right? So now when I have someone from the team come to me and say, "Hey, Dharmesh, like we want you to do the speaking thing, we want you to do this, or whatever the ask might be," I have a much easier time saying no, because I've already expressed here are the areas of focus. So if the thing you're asking for, although completely worthy, not I don't love all our teams equally, but it's like right now these are the things I'm working on. So as worthy as your ask might be, I'm going to have to respectfully say no. And the other kind of hack, and this was just around scheduling, and this takes some kind of finesse over time, is around, we tend to like let our calendars and our schedules get fragmented because there's these kind of impositions that happen from the, and sometimes it's unavoidable if you're kind of earlier in your career based on the stage of the company. But we almost never fight back on it, right? So my kind of suggestion, my hack here would be to start like blocking out contiguous blocks of time, right? And then if it turns out that I've got this 4-hour block carved out, or 6-hour block carved out on a random Thursday afternoon, and the team's like, okay, I'm really trying to like pull this meeting together, this is the only time we have, fine, I'll make exceptions. I'm not hard-nosed about it, but just don't let your schedule get too defragmented unintentionally. It's like if it happens because it's completely unavoidable and the cost of trying to keep it contiguous is just too high, I get that. There's a tax we all pay. But I think just being more deliberate about that contiguous time, because then that kind of maximizes the opportunity you have to get into that flow state, right? That says now you have a fighting chance at least that for that period of time. And you may not, I don't think very few people do. Let's say you even had a 4 or 6 hour block. If you can even get an hour and a half or 2 hours of that like really productive time being in the flow state, that works. So give your calendar a fighting chance, try to block out, and you don't have to do it all at once. Maybe it's like, like every week I'm going to block off 4 hours that I'm going to just use for think time, and trying to get into that and see how that progresses over time.
Yeah, thanks. Sounds like hard. That is also hard-won advice. One of the transitions that I'm hearing here that's I've seen hardest for many of the entrepreneurs is you go from being founder, coder, all things, one, then two, then a few of you, and then you go into this management role and you just naturally become CEO, CTO, and now all of a sudden you're in charge of 20, 30 people. But what I've seen is that they can't stop micromanaging because their identity is related to it. You went through this transition. I see it all the time when I speak to people who are managers, and they're like, "Oh, I'm just available to people all the time." I would say the managers at home probably have this the worst, right? The professional parent one, but I see it in startup entrepreneurs who can't change that, and their style never changes, and then their hands are in everything because that's how they think they keep control. How did you transition to now managing 7,000 people and still being able to block out 4 to 6 hours to do deep work?
So I'm with HubSpot. So I'm going to answer this. We're going to go back in time to my first startup because that's probably kind of more relevant. It was my first one. I was earlier in my career, but at HubSpot, just not overly widely known fact is that although there are 7,000 people, I have exactly 0 direct reports. And that was put in place at time t equals 0 when Brian and I co-founded the company. One of the things we talked about was who would be CEO. We decided he would be CEO. I'd done it before, suck at it. And we made the decision that I was not going to manage anyone. And my reasoning here, and this advice you can apply. Like you might not be able to kind of get away with the I'm not going to manage anyone, although you should try it. Maybe you can. Is around this notion of I think too many times we're focused a lot on kind of mitigating our weaknesses, right? That's like here are the 14 things I need to do, and I don't do them that well, and I'm going to just improve. I'm going to kind of get everything to like an acceptable level. And the decision I made around management was around I didn't want to spend the next 5, 10, 20 years of my life becoming passively okay at management. I'm like, I'm just not going to do that. And so it's like instead of that, I'm going to kind of try to double down on my strengths. There are a limited number of things I'm good at, and I'm going to try to maximize the amount of time I spend on those things and getting the most return out of my strengths versus trying to mitigate my weaknesses, right? And I think at a macro level, whether it's management or something else, I think that's something you should kind of work towards, even whatever stage in your career you are, is to say, okay, well, and then if you're a serial killer, mitigate that weakness. Try not to be one of those. But most other things you can sort of like, if you're good enough at your core strengths and if you amplify them, the world will let you get away with a fair amount, much more than you think they would otherwise. For instance, the other thing I don't do, haven't done this for 20 years, is I don't do phone calls. It's just one of those things, right? Like I have this pathological aversion to phone calls, and people know this. I don't do phone calls. This is just one of my things. And so anyway, so the advice here would be to the degree that you can get away with it, try to increase the amount of time you spend on your strengths, which also happens to be highly correlated with things you enjoy, as it turns out. And if you can spend more time doing that thing, I think one of the mistakes companies make is that the assumption is, let's say you're a developer, happen to be a software developer, an engineer, is that, oh, well, your kind of success is measured by how many people report to you and like, downstream, right? It's like, oh, I've got a team of 5, 10, 20. And that's the wrong way to kind of measure output, is like the number of people you're managing. It's like, and for some people, management is that strength, and that's awesome. But that's not necessarily true. It's certainly not true in my case. But anyway, yeah. So
great. One thing I saw from that came out clearly in the culture code. The first little one is if people haven't seen it, they've got this amazing culture code template that you can get, and then they also share their own. And one of the things that you see in their own is that you are favoring an autonomy in your teams a lot. That seems like one, it requires a lot of trust from you to them, but then it seems like one that we can say, but it's really hard to do. Maybe you could tell us a little. Does it really work? Is it possible to do?
It does work, and in my mind, and this goes back to culture. I'll give you kind of my kind of short kind of thing of what culture is. And one thing I've learned is it's very helpful to think of culture as a product. So whatever your company is, you're actually building 2 products. The first product is the product you're building for customers. That's the kind of classical product, whatever business you're in, or you're offering. If you're in the service business, same kind of thing. And the other one is the product that you build for your people, and that's what culture really is. And if you accept that to be true, which I would argue that it is, then it's like, okay, well, what are the things that I do in order to make a successful product for customers? It's like, oh, well, I get their feedback, and the better my product is, the easier marketing is going to be because it's going to pull in customers. I'm going to get word of mouth. The exact same things actually apply to culture, which is, okay, if you want to get culture right, you have to actually, figure out who your customers are. In this case, it's your team, it's your people, whether you're 2 people or 20 people or 200. And the other kind of corollary to that is, if you think of culture as a product, there is no product that is ever actually done, right? This is the other classic mistake entrepreneurs make, is like, oh, as I grow and scale, if I can just hold on to my startup culture, then I've succeeded, then I have a winning culture and I've done the right thing. And that is absolutely not the right way to look at it, right? Because just like a product needs to be iterated on and improved, and it needs to serve the customers at a moment in time, your culture needs to improve, be iterated on, and serve your people at that moment in time. And what you need from the culture, what the people need from the culture at 20 people, 200 people, 2,000 people, is going to be different than what was necessary. And so we conflate sometimes this notion of having core values, which is fine. Like, we value autonomy and transparency, but that's not the only thing culture is. You have to kind of think of culture as the thing that is kind of pulling employees in, and the thing that helps them do their best work. That's the kind of purpose of that particular product. And so in my mind, and this goes back to the autonomy thing, is that I fundamentally believe it is a more effective way to run a company. I can make that argument, and there might be people that cannot argue that, and that's fine. But a equally strong argument is that, and Dan Pink has made this in the past, which is autonomy is on the list of things that the best people look for. And if you don't have that as a quote unquote feature of your product is not going to sell all that well to those particular constituents that you're trying to kind of bring into your team and engage them and keep them for a very long time. So it's it works in terms of, I think it makes for a better company. And yes, it does require a degree of trust, but there's a part of it that's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. That if you know you have a culture of autonomy, you're going to allow people to make decisions, make mistakes, have failures. And then there's this kind of self-selection bias. People that are gravitating towards the company are the ones that kind of thrive on that autonomy, but it also forces you to kind of pick the right kind of people that are not going to betray that trust and betray that autonomy, right? Because the penalty is really, really high for making mishires. So I think it's over time, it's worked for us, and people did question it in the early years of HubSpot, but it still continues to be true today at 7,000 people. It continues to work even as a publicly traded company.
Great. I mean, I think as you're talking about it, like, I can feel some of the passion and how much you've invested in it. One of the big challenges for, I think, many early startups is sometimes they don't hire because they're too afraid to fire. The other time they hire, but they use these exorbitant Google, like, 8-hour day, I'm going to evaluate everybody like in this particular way, which introduces largely the opportunity to just have so many biases be applied unintentionally to it. Your approach has real risks to it. Was there ever a time where, like, you made not great hires, and then how did you're such a kind and generous person, I imagine Brian the same. How risky was it? How were you able to come to terms with letting people go who are, like, part of an early team?
Yeah, it is risky. So one thing I think we need to, it's risky, but in terms of, that's kind of the whole thing about startups, right? It's just a collection of risks, varying degrees, that you're taking and trying to kind of pull through. So yeah, we made mishires, and yes, we have generally a kind, gentle culture. Both Brian and I are kind of lean that way. But in the grand scheme of things, even though we may have responded late or detected it late, that we had made a mishire, you fix it and you kind of move on. But you shouldn't keep that from. You shouldn't let that fear of the possible bad outcome keep you from achieving the potential great outcome of attracting the best possible people that will change the face of the company over time, right? So you do your best going in. The other kind of hack I would give you is kind of be a deliberate and intentional about your culture, but also write it down. It doesn't have to be 128 slides like HubSpot's culture code is. But because I think one of the other mistakes entrepreneurs make is that everyone will say, "Oh, we hire for culture." And then if you ask them, it's like, okay, so what is your culture? And if they can't answer the question, what they're really saying is, we like to hire people just like ourselves, right? And HubSpot certainly made this mistake in our early years because we had not written our culture down. And so there's like multiple pieces of value. One is writing the culture down forces you, even within the founding team or the early team, like agreeing on what the culture is, and you'll be surprised the possible incongruence even amongst the founding team in terms of what the kind of culture is or should be. And the other one is that once you have that, if you can kind of put it out there early in the process, then the people that are not going to be good fits will self-select out at a much higher rate than they would otherwise, right? Because people come in, we assume good intent, right? They're coming into the company with good intent. But if they don't know what your culture is actually like because you've never told the world, and they not maybe glean that from the interviews because we're kind of in interview mode, then you have a higher risk of attracting people that are just not going to further the culture in the way that you want. And so my advice would be kind of write it down, even if it's just like a single sheet of paper that you kind of come to terms with, and then be transparent about it. Because the last thing you want is for people that are not going to be a good fit to be joining.
Yeah. I'll give you a shout out on transparency here. In you talked about diversity and equity and how early on, like you value diverse opinions. You think it's an important business and strategic advantage, but you didn't start it out that way because you weren't clear about your culture, and so it was hiring people just like you who would fit in and be able to take on the work that you were doing. But the other one was they have a beautiful slide that talks about what's the difference between diversity and inclusion. And if it's okay, I'll just quote it here for the team. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And unfortunately, like in healthcare, I've been in a whole bunch of things where they've done big diversity, equity, inclusion, and they've gotten a bunch of people who are diverse into a room, but then they've never been asked to speak, right? So it was a beautiful one, and I was like, wow, you could feel that forward. So a big shout out. I think that I have to ask you about remote work because, like, there's all these CEOs out there going, it's a cancer, you can't do it. There's you guys in Basecamp, I would say, like these sane voices saying, hey, wait a minute. Can you just talk to us a little bit about remote work? When new entrepreneurs are starting, they're sometimes hiring now across the country when their team is entirely remote from the beginning. That has its own challenges for culture. So maybe you could just share some of your insights you've got and what you're thinking of the future now for HubSpot.
Yeah, a couple of things. So even pre-pandemic, which seems like 300 years ago now, HubSpot was already on the path to becoming increasingly remote. I think it was somewhere around 15 to 20% of our full-time employees were remote back then, right? Pre-pandemic. And I had gotten up on many stages and saying, we expect this curve to be continuing to going up. And it was a deliberate, intentional decision we had made. And our motivation for that decision was twofold. Number one is that we found it to be highly statistically unlikely that if we really wanted to hire the best people in the world, that those best people actually happen to live within a 1 hour commute of where we happen to have an office, right? Like that seems like just fundamentally untrue, right? Okay, as a math scientist,
MIT, close your ears.
Yeah, so like if you truly want to hire the best people, then like, okay, well, increase the chances that you will be able to hire them, and remote makes a lot of sense. That's thing number one. Thing number two that we've learned is going back to the kind of culture as product. So one of the things we do, just the same way we do surveys of our customers to figure out what about the product they like, what features do they enjoy, what bugs are there. We do the same thing with our culture. It's like, okay, well, what do you like about the culture? What features do you enjoy? What are the bugs in the culture? And one of the things we've learned, and this is hands down, it's always been in the top like 3 or 4, but this notion of flexibility. So it's not about remote work, and I think that I understand where the term kind of came from, but even the term remote implies that there's some central headquarters that you're remote from, right? So I much prefer like distributed or some other phrase, but even putting that aside, flexibility, the ability for people to be able to achieve harmony, and this kind of goes to the balance thing, right? The way to do that is to say, okay, well, it's not about the hours that you work, but if you can kind of make the time available that you need to in your particular schedule based on your particular situation, that has a much higher value to people than actually everything else right now. And we've surveyed our people. So we made the deliberate decision. Not only were we not going to go back into the office and force that, which we thought would have been a silly move, we also didn't go the other way and say, oh, we're just going to be fully remote and everyone has to be distributed. It's like, okay, we'll let every individual employee decide whether they want to be in the office, because there's some people that get value from that. If you want to be fully remote, that's fine too, or some mix thereof, like some sort of hybrid model. So, but if you had to lean one way or the other, my advice would be is remote does actually work. Don't discount it. I know there are the naysayers, and there's definitely attacks to it. It is harder. but you do get good at it. You have to. It's a skill that you develop just like anything else, and you get better at it over time. But the upside of having that kind of openness to having talent from anywhere, giving them the flexibility. And this, even like on the kind of diversity and inclusion front, it actually opens up the funnel much more, right? In terms of who you can bring onto the team versus if you're in these kind of locales wherever you happen to have an office, because otherwise you're constrained essentially by what are the demographics of that particular area happen to be geographically.
Yeah, super. And I think that there's lots of good data around gender inclusion because of it, because of the primary caregiver roles that are still very gender biased. There is, I'll say, I think that in remote work, sorry, I like that what you said in your slides, which is work is not a place, but an activity that you do. And that was very helpful. I think also the recognition that there are different ways that different people like to work is also a very helpful one. And then I think the one on the hard CEO side is that sometimes having a work context with all of the external cues is helpful for us as human beings to say, now I'm in this mode. And then I can leave those things in that place and go to another one. Sometimes people don't do that at home, and that can cause real problems. But that's why we have spaces like the CIC, which makes this far more possible for organizations to help support it, right? Because they can create this kind of space. Basecamp does one other thing, which is they do their 6-week adventures, and they bring their team together for 1 week. In person, and they pay for them to their hotels. That also feels like, especially where you're building culture, that also has impact. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a high return. So if you do have a kind of distributed remote team, then having ways for them to kind of, because you do have these kind of high bandwidth conversations, stronger connection. I think that's undisputed, right? And so we do that, and we do that either spontaneously, where local groups of people that happen to be in the same geography, or bringing them together on a regular basis. I think that helps a lot.
Great.
One more thought on the remote work. This is near and dear to my heart. We talk about diversity, but diversity exists along lots of different dimensions. One of which is around like the kind of emotional makeup of a person, right? Which is, I happen to be an introvert, extreme, like on the introvert to extrovert scale. I'm hyper introverted. As it turns out, remote work actually lends itself better to introverted people, because if I'm in a meeting full of people in person, even me, right? Like, and I'm one of the founders of the company, I have a hard time sometimes like kind of speaking up, right? Like interjecting. But if I'm in a Zoom meeting and we have a Slack chat going on or whatever, I'm like one of the most active people with like little kind of sometimes little funny commentary or whatever. It's like, oh, I have this idea I can follow, I can kind of get it out of my system, because you have these kind of multiple channels of communication that once again, kind of cater to different styles. And the extroverts will kind of get a word in regardless, right? Regardless of what the channel happens to be. But remote work actually tends to help out introverts more than being in person.
I think it's nice, and I've not thought about it before, but this idea of like how many companies are founded by extroverts versus should we have more? What would the world be like if we had more companies founded by introverts? I think it's something for us all to think about. I know we're into the audience participation time, but I just wanted to ask about AI, if I may, because I do think it might be on some people's minds. So I'm going to take that as a virtual question, and then we'll open it up for some audience questions. You've been diving into AI. You've built this tool, the chatspot.ai. So you've gotten to know it quite a bit. You seem ebullient about some aspects of it. If you could tell us a little bit about what you're really excited about, and then if you could just tell us how you think about a lot of these concerns that are out there.
So I'll try to keep this brief. So I've been in tech now for 30 plus years, writing software. The generative AI movement specifically, that kind of was sparked by the launch of ChatGPT in November of last year, is the single biggest kind of paradigm shift, technology shift, whatever thing you want to use, I've experienced in my professional career since, even compared to the internet back in the day in terms of the potential. And I think, and I'm not the only one saying this. This is agreed on by a lot of people, and there are risks, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But I think the big kind of shift in our mindset that we need to make is, we've been using computers, machines, essentially as computational tools, and they've been great at that, right? So we can write imperative code, which is what we do as software engineers, that gives the machine instructions to be able to achieve some sort of outcome or some goal. What generative AI now does is that it turns machines into more of a reasoning tool versus just a pure computational tool, right? So yes, it can write a blog post, and that's great. But it can also actually be fed a bunch of information. It can kind of quote unquote learn, and come up with really good answers to things you would never have thought a machine would be able to do, right? And we're just at the very, very kind of beginning stages of that. It's moving very quickly. So two messages I think we should all collectively walk away with is that it is massive, it is very real, and it's very useful regardless of what line of work you happen to be, whether you're an entrepreneur or working at a company. So I think it would behoove you to at least understand what the technology is capable of. And if you're a entrepreneur looking at ideas, it is likely applicable to your world. Or just in the same way the internet, it's like, okay, well, there were like the pre-internet companies, like once the browser came along, it's like, okay, well, this is sort of part of the fabric of society now, right? Which it very quickly became. This is that only bigger, and it's going to spread faster. So I think it's helpful. And I'm not a maximalist in terms of, oh, AI is the best thing ever and there are absolutely zero risks. I'm much more of a pragmatist. I understand the risks, but humanity seems to generally find a way through. And every time we've had these kind of technology leaps, and one could argue this is different from all the others that have come before, but we've had the same kinds of concerns, right? Like first order concerns, like, oh, this is going to decrease the number of jobs. It's going to decrease the degree to which humans flourish. I just don't think that's true because it hasn't been true in the past when we've had similar concerns. Not to take away from the fact that we should have the best and the brightest digging into the actual real risks and doing what we can to mitigate them, but that should not keep us from trying to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks. A real pragmatist approach. I would say that it's one of the things that in this hyperlinked world, one of the things that people forget is that hyperlinks allow you to go to the source material very quickly. It's something like in medicine that it's always helped me, right? Yep. I've seen slides from professors here at Harvard, like telling me this is what the slide means, and then when I look at the paper myself, my interpretation is quite different. I would say there's a lot of hyperbole out there with, there's this future of life petition that's saying stop AI and end all things. If you read the petition yourself, it's thoughtful, right? It's saying there's lots of potential. These are the harms that we think we know about already, and they're worth discussing. They're not asking you to put down GPT-3 or 4. They're just saying like, hey, as we think about the more powerful generation, maybe it's time to think about it. So I highly recommend that you consider looking at it yourself. It'll make you far more informed than another 2 hours of whatever TV news talk show is telling us about it. I'm just going to turn it over to some audience questions. I know we've got a few minutes, so forgive us for having that. We'll try to follow up after. Yes, we have one question here.
Hi. So Gallup actually did a recent study of around 27 million employees, 2.5 million work units. And what they found was 82% of managers are bad fits. Okay. 1 in 10 managers tend to be naturally good managers. What they also found is that companies with a majority of good managers earn on average 142% more than their competitors. Okay. What advice can you give for navigating in managers in within your own company, or how to, because this is closely aligned to burnout. Bad managers will burn out your employees and will cost the company overall billions.
Yeah. Dharmesh, did you hear the question, or do you need me to repeat it?
Yep, okay. I got it. So it's a great question, and this is something that now in hindsight is much clearer to me than it was as we were growing HubSpot, because I think we were part of the problem as are most startups that go into scale ups. And I think the source of the problem is that we put people into management because they were successful at whatever individual contributor role that they happened to have, because that was the natural progression of things, without ever recognizing the fact that management is a skill. And that is something that can be learned, but actually has to be taught. If you haven't been through it, you don't kind of emerge from the womb being an exceptionally good manager. You might have empathy, you might have some of the traits of good managers, but management itself as a discipline is an actual skill that one needs to kind of learn and then over time master. And so I think first order advice would be don't necessarily push people into management that may not want to do it. And if you do encourage them to move into management because they want to, let's say, then invest in the kind of the time and energy to make them at least passably good managers, if not good to great managers over time. Because I think right now what we're doing is throwing them into the deep end. It's like, oh, by the way, congratulations, you are now a manager and you have this new fancy title and you've got 5 people reporting to you who are all going to be miserable for the next 2 years because you have no idea what you're doing.
Great. Thanks. We're almost at time. We have one question there, but I'll take all the other questions. And if Dharmesh, it's okay, I'll collect them and then send them back, and we can send them out to people if we have their email addresses. Hallie, you have a question online?
Yeah, it's from Jordan in London. He said he would like to know a bit more about your long-term vision for ChatSpot and generative AI. He's an enthusiast.
Okay, sure. I'll try to keep this brief as well. And by the way, thanks for staying up. If you're in London, that means you're past midnight as well, almost 1 a.m. there. So let's abstract this up a level, right? So what ChatSpot is a natural language interface to for marketing and sales people, which happens to be our target market. But I think the opportunity for many of us in the room is that if you're working in tech or software at all, for the longest time, developers of software have said, "Oh, we make intuitive, easy to use software." Almost every software company says that, and almost all of them are lying because the historical way that we interact with software, regardless of what software happens to be, is we have some mental model in our head of the thing we're trying to accomplish. I'm trying to do this in Photoshop. I'm trying to do this in HubSpot, whatever it happens to be. And then you have to kind of translate that mental model into a series of clicks and drags and swipes or whatever in the hopes that you kind of achieve the outcome you're looking for. And that's not intuitive at all. It's the exact opposite of intuitive, right? Because you're trying to translate the thing you're looking for into something the machine will understand and be able to do based on whoever designed the software. What generative AI opens up, and this is the thing that ChatSpot is doing for our customers, is to say, oh, we can now allow humans to express themselves in natural language and describe the thing they're trying to do. It's like, oh, I want to know how many customers we signed up last month that were from Europe. And it's like, that's a reasonable question. Now, in most software, including ours, we'd have to go through a series of 25 or 30 clicks and build a report or build a query to answer that question or do whatever it happens to be. Generative AI now makes it possible for people to actually express their intent in whatever their natural language happens to be. English, let's say, is one example, and then accomplish that goal. So I think all software over time will now have that kind of natural language alternative. I'm not saying it's going to replace graphical user interfaces or mobile interfaces, but there's a large body of use cases where humans should not have to be forced to translate the thing they're asking for into a series of touches, drags, and swipes. There's a better way now. That wasn't really possible a year ago. And trust me, I've tried for 15 years to achieve that same vision. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited about AI, is that it's now possible to do the thing I've been trying to do for years and years.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm just going to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank everyone for joining us online. And thank you, Dharmesh.
Thank you, everyone.
Really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you when you're back. I hope you have safe travels.
Thank you.
As well. Bye. Thanks, everyone.